we lacked a holistic conception of this. We tend to segment the world into various regions, and this is always a flaw. China doesn't really do that. I mean, of course, it talks of itself as the Middle Kingdom, so it sort of sees everything from its own perspective, and it's very useful to look at other people's maps to see, how the world looks from their vantage point. Talking of Canadians, which we did when the Canadians were in charge of the Arctic Council, I was on a visit to Canada, and they spread out a map in front of me of looking at the world from the vantage point of Canada and the Arctic. And believe me, the world looks like a very different, rather cold and frosty place from that vantage point. But you see how different things look from other people's perspectives. And that's, I think, what the United States needs to do. We need to start engaging with all of our allies and talking to them and consulting with them. Because I don't think, again, that they're going to be trusting us, seeing us back if we're not in the process of consultation. And I think there's a lot of trauma right now, not just on the part of the Europeans, but also Canadians, Mexicans, and many others. I think thinking about the way that we've kind of ridden roughshod over them, not just in the last 4 years, but in previous administrations as well, in terms of not engaging on critical issues, not listening to them and hearing their perspective.
I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. I'm pleased to welcome you to week 6 of our virtual spring 2021 lecture series, number 46, examining the first 100 days of the Biden administration, a survey course for all. This lecture series continues with the evening's program, Fixing What's Wrong, What's Broken, America's Place in the World, where we will welcome a panel of distinguished foreign policy experts who will examine the many challenges, crises, and opportunities that the Biden administration faces in determining America's role in a rapidly changing world order. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christina Coolidge, a faculty member from the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University, who will introduce this evening's moderator. Christina.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone to what is the 6th event in our survey course for everyone. For those of you who have been tuning in or who have been required to tune in, you'll know that this course is examining the early days, the infancy of the Biden administration in terms of the major policy initiatives that are on Biden's agenda. We deliberately chose not to refer to this policy area as foreign policy, but rather to take a wider approach and ask exactly what is America's place in the world. So undoubtedly, the Biden administration faces numerous challenges with respect to that space. Who are we? How do we redefine our role? Do we want to redefine our role? How do we fix soft power? What do we do with alliances? How do we deal with the pandemic? How do we deal with trade, our neighbors, our enemies, near and far? And we have an amazing set of speakers tonight who will address different pieces of this agenda and try to put together a more holistic view. So our panelists tonight, I am very pleased to introduce to you are Dr. Fiona Hill, who is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on US and Europe at the Brookings Institute, Enrique Perret, who is the Director of the US-Mexico Foundation, Lyric Thompson, who is a Director at the International Center for Research on Women, and Dr. Stephen Wertheim, who is co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I am really looking forward to the conversation. I will try to keep myself from injecting questions myself. And I'm now very pleased to throw this over to Elise Labott, who is a writer, columnist, and contributor to Foreign Policy magazine, which is a premier publication in this space. Elise, the panel's yours.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Really an all-star panel to talk about these weighty issues of foreign policy. And so Christina has introduced everyone. And so let's just dive in, shall we? Stephen Wertheim, let's start with you and talk about, President Biden has said, declared America's back. And you've written in numerous articles recently that you're worried America's going to go back to some old stances of hegemony and military dominance. You call for a new strategic logic, full withdrawal from Afghanistan, immediate re-entering the Iran deal, putting what you say the interests of the American people ahead of the quest for global dominance, and essentially render our enemies no longer threats by kind of what you call jettisoning grandiose objectives, which is pretty much, as you say, a retrenchment policy. Let's talk about how you balance that with the U.S. global leadership role, or are you suggesting that the U.S. necessarily shouldn't be looking for that, leadership dominating role anymore?
Well, thanks. It's good to be with everyone this evening. I think what's happened over the course of my adult lifetime for about 3 decades is that even in the absence of totalitarian competitors, after the Soviet Union completely collapsed, the United States decided not to reap the peace dividend, but rather to extend its armed dominance over even more of the world than it had before. And its rates of use of armed force since 1991 have actually gotten significantly greater than they did even during the Cold War itself. And so what I'm worried about is that when President Biden says that America's back, what he means is that America's back to the essentials of the role that it played, not necessarily under President Trump, but under President Trump's predecessors, when I think this was fundamentally the wrong strategic course for the United States. And I think what the Biden administration is wagering is that on top of the globe-spanning military role of the United States, in which the United States divides the world into subordinate allies and multiplying adversaries, it can layer on top of that, good things like cooperation on climate change, pandemic disease. And I worry that that's, essentially what past administrations have tried to do as well. But the kind of antagonisms that are generated, and quite frankly, feudal wars for the United States that are generated by dividing the world in this way, tend to predominate in our actual foreign policy making and in the kind of outcomes that unfortunately we've achieved over several decades.
Well, I think Stephen and I might differ slightly. I kind of have the impression that the administration is backing away a little bit, maybe not as fast as Stephen would like, but I do think that the president has kind of said, we want to get out of these forever wars. We do want to get out of Afghanistan, maybe do it a little bit more responsibly than they argue the Trump administration was. But let me ask Fiona, and I know we have a lot of people who have been following Fiona's work, not just during the Trump administration, but before and after. Fiona, when we talk about the threat from Russia per se, do you think retrenchment is the way to eliminate the threat from Russia? You recently told The Economist we should deal with Russia, and you said a quote, at a point of acute confrontation, and point out that, look, we've shared these interests with Russia on COVID-19, climate change in the Arctic. You've made the point that if we really did want to have this cooperative relationship with Russia and they wanted it with Trump, that would have happened, but we still see all these provocations. So how do, as you say, take the edge off this confrontational relationship and stop careening from crisis to confrontation, where President Putin is really just continues to try and settle old scores, undermine alliances, and demonstrate to the world that he has the upper hand?
Thanks very much, Elise. It's very interesting listening to Stephen lay out his thinking here, because I do think that idea of kind of going backwards could put us into, certain sets of predicaments, because I mean, clearly the world is changing very fast. And we've already touched upon, some of the issues that we're going to have to contend with. It's not just a national security perspective, certainly of the old style, that we're looking ahead to in the future. We're going to be in a world that is going to be really, I think, dramatically shaped in very different ways, and in some regards perhaps unforeseeable at the moment, by the effects of COVID-19, the pandemic. We're not out of that yet. And I think that, that will have had all kinds of repercussions and reverberations that will play out for some considerable period of time. This is a massive inflection point. And so I think, an overall assessment of where we are is certainly in order. If you think about 2020, the year we just got out of, and yet it's somehow, I think we all still feel we're still in it, particularly now we're in this kind of virtual environment together. It wasn't just the year of the pandemic, it was a year of massive political upheaval in the United States, and a year of socioeconomic crisis. Again, very much like periods that we've seen, over our history, different junctures after World War I with the great influenza, after World War II with all the destruction of Europe. But we also saw the effects of climate change that have become pretty much inescapable. We've seen the largest number of hurricanes on record battering the Gulf Coast, droughts, as well as floods, hitting so many communities over and over again. And I think, we've at this point, we've got to kind of assess where we are. We tend to, when we think about going back, as Stephen has suggested, going back to earlier periods of geopolitical, not necessarily retrenchment, but kind of maneuvering. And we're just not in that place anymore. And I think that there are existential threats to the United States, as well as to Russia and others, that we're going to have to address. The challenge, however, is getting Russia and other countries out of that mindset. We're talking about a systemic competition that we've entered into with China, very different from the relationship with China in the past. China has obviously been implicated in many different ways in the pandemic, but is also, proving to be something of a conventional military threat and potentially a rising nuclear threat. And, we're all wondering whether we're going to head off into a new Cold War or kind of a form of a geostrategic competition with China like we saw with the Soviet Union in the past. I think that's possibly what, Stephen is talking about there as well. And Russia remains, very sadly and unfortunately, as I said in this point of acute confrontation that you were citing me about, it's itself stuck in a previous mindset. As far as Russia is concerned, they're still kind of working through the last 30 years, which wasn't, for them a peace dividend, as, Stephen is suggesting that, we might have had, but it's for them a period of loss and a period of decline, because Russia lost the Soviet Union. It, in fact, twice in the 20th century, as Putin keeps talking about, the Russian state was lost, first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And although Russia became the successor state to both of these entities, Russia's been propelled forward over the last 30 years by the sense of restoration, of restoring the state internally and then restoring its global position. And unfortunately, it still remains the fact that Russia sees us, the United States, as a major threat. It hasn't got out of that mindset that we could be something different other than the previous global superpower competitor. And it continuously looks at our capabilities, conventionally and nuclear, the leadership role that the United States has enjoyed pretty much unassailed for the last 30 years until really the rise of China. And Russia continues to focus on how can it counter the United States? How can it push back the perceived threat from the United States? And we've got ourselves stuck into what is an extraordinarily unhealthy and very unstable relationship with Russia that, clearly in the last administration, we didn't get out of. But if we go back to, where we were before, we don't have much chance of changing that either. There's no silver bullet. It's going to be very difficult. But somehow I'm kind of hoping that by framing and reframing where we are in this world post-pandemic, we might find some way of trying to stabilize that and find some new footing for not just the relationship with Russia, but with others as well. Very difficult, but this is something that, again, we have to look forward to a future that's going to be very difficult for all of us, not back to a past that we certainly can't replicate.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot throughout the hour about this whole idea of competition versus dealing with some of these threats that we need, really, China and Russia and other countries to deal with. Enrique, let's talk about that competition with China. President Biden has said this is his, greatest challenge. I know you think about how this affects issues of trade, supply chain, the need to work with other allies to pivot away from China, particularly on issues like the supply chain for many industries. And you argue that we can strengthen this through trade with other countries, and really just look in our own backyard, particularly with Mexico and Canada. And it does seem that the administration in their early meetings are thinking about that.
Thank you, Elise, and very happy to be here with you today. Thank you to the Suffolk University and GBH. Yes, totally. I think, it's all about supply chains, and it's all about technology, right? Not just because the pandemic guide us to that, to many essential industries. Now we talk about essential industries, and there is a list of that, automotive industry, aerospace, telecom, and we are now seeing the effects of one specific industry like semiconductors impacting a lot of other industries. And obviously, because the dependency of United States with China in plenty of components, I think through the last decade, starting with Obama and then President Trump was very, very tough on China, implementing tariff and very, in his narrative, that's something that both Democrats and Republicans agree. They need to be tough on China on intellectual property, on, just be very unfair on trade. And just recently, President Biden signed one out of the 40 executive orders he already signed in just 70 days. That for me is very impressive. I'm not from the U.S. I'm from Mexico, and I think that the highest numbers of executive orders it was Donald Trump with 220. Biden in 70 days already have 40, right? And that means a lot on the narrative. It doesn't mean that all of them, all of the executive orders will have a properly implementation, but one of them was about supply chains. And it's basically President Biden talking with his cabinet saying, you need to find a way to pivoting out China. We cannot depend anymore on China because time, cost, but particularly because democracy and because rule of law, let's say. And on that, I think there is two ways to see this. One is just buy America, right? Just let's make America great again. Let's build everything in America, right? From chips to auto parts to, everything. And that cannot be done, right? There is no labor force and all the capacity in US to do everything, right? So you need to rely on your partners, in this case on allies, right? Because it's not only about economy, it's also national security, it's also migration. We used to say that in the US-Mexico relationship, that is very complex. In the past, you can try to agree in one specific topic, right? You have the working group for migration, the working group on security, the working group on trade, on energy. Now you cannot do that. Now everything is tangled up. When you talk about migration, you also are talking about economy. When you talk about security, you are also talking about migration. So it's very, very complex right now. I think the Biden administration is in the right direction of supply chain. They need to find the real strategies with allies. And listen, you have the USMCA now signed by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. I think it's an amazing platform. And you have other countries in the continent like Colombia, like Brazil, that can play a huge role in this supply chain to help US on this tech race. I don't like to call a trade war with China. I prefer to call it a tech race, like the nuclear race and the space race in the past. These will settle the basis of, to engage with technology for the next 50 years. And it's a very tough race. Listen, I heard we launched a report called the Ally Shoring Report, in which how US can, use these allies to create or reshape the supply chain. But I saw another document called the Democratic Supply Chain. So goes further, right? I mean, only make trade with democratic countries, right?
Right.
That will be tough, but
yeah, we're going to get to the issue of democracy in a bit. I just want to bring in Lyric, because Enrique brought up the idea of a lot of these executive orders and changing the narrative. And during his first few months, US President Biden has signaled a radically different approach on women and gender issues, which you follow very closely. Certainly different than President Trump, who kind of led efforts to pare back international efforts on sexual and reproductive health. For instance, he repealed some Trump-era policies like the global gag rule, banning international nonprofits that provide abortion counseling. There's a gender policy council to look at how women's health is affected by the pandemic. And there are some promising signals in terms of gender equality and women's issues being factored into spending or foreign policy. But, I think that you have launched a kind of fuller argument about how there needs to be more of a feminist foreign policy where women's issues really need to be at front and center on some of these issues, whether it's climate, trade, migration. Talk to us about that.
Happy to. Thank you so much for the invitation to our hosts and organizers and to fellow panelists. I'm enjoying the conversation and learning more about your work. So in 2014, Sweden wrote the world's first feminist foreign policy. And at the time, it was sort of greeted by suspicion or a sense of, oh, well, of course, that's Sweden, it's a niche Nordic thing. Or even outright laughter, the former foreign minister will tell you. And then nothing really happened with that for several years. And then in 2017, Canada sort of dipped a toe in the water and said they would have a feminist international assistance policy. So not the full suite of foreign policy tools, but their development assistance would similarly be feminist. Subsequently, they have been joined by a handful of countries, including Mexico, which became the first country in Latin America and the first country in the global South to do so last year. What does that mean? Well, according to the Swedes, who, like I said, wrote the playbook, that meant three things: an increasing focus on women's rights in their multilateral and bilateral strategic dialogues, increasing resourcing available for women's rights and gender equality. Sweden hovers around 90% of their development assistance that supports gender equality as either a primary or secondary goal, which is definitely an outlier and a leader in terms of the OECD, the global donor countries in the world tracking their gender investments, certainly way ahead of where the United States is. And then finally, representation. That there would be more female ambassadors, ministers of relevant ministries. There were the apparatus, and I should say Sweden had a feminist government at the time. So that was a commitment that they made across both foreign and domestic policy. That has kind of been a bit of a blueprint for many of the countries who have subsequently joined on. Our assessment of this is, in this day and age, as Enrique said, everything's all intersecting and connected together. Fiona talked about the climate crisis, et cetera. Our sense is that the tool of gender analysis, or in this case, feminist analysis, which is taking a power-based analysis to our foreign policy, needs to be much broader than it's simply a focus on how are women doing, or are there more female ambassadors, what have you. We've added 2 R's to Sweden's mnemonic device, one of which is reach, that for this to be a coherent approach, there needs to be an equal emphasis on these issues across all streams of foreign policy, not just the soft power streams where I think we saw an emphasis on gender beginning in development, then diplomacy. We want to see that in defense. We want to see it in trade. Certainly following the last 4 years, immigration is a big piece of our proposal. And then also research. Even Sweden, as wonderful as it is, has not invested in an independent evaluation of their success of their policy. What has it achieved? What kind of impact has it had? And so we'd very much like to add that this is a continual learning and evaluation process. I have shared a slide that I think we can throw up to give you a sense of, all right, that sounds like a big agenda. What are we doing? What are we actually calling on the Biden-Harris administration to do? So it's everything from the triage of the first day or first week or 10 days, the blizzard of executive orders that came out. As you mentioned, Elise, getting rid of the global gag rule, getting rid of a similarly harmful executive order that banned federal government contractors from providing any training on racism or white supremacy. We very much take an intersectional approach to our agenda, which is to say, again, it's not just about women's rights. It's about how is power being withheld, denied, how are people being marginalized across a number of demographic considerations. So gender, certainly, sexual orientation, race, ability, indigeneity, rurality, et cetera. The Biden-Harris administration has, of course, rescinded those executive orders, rejoined the Paris Agreement, rejoined the World Health Organization, is campaigning for a seat at the Human Rights Council. All of that is really good to see. They did, as you mentioned, launch the White House Gender Policy Council. What is that? It's not a foreign policy mechanism, but it does have a foreign policy focus across both a national and domestic architecture. So there is a senior executive director reporting to the president who has a policy staff. In the Obama administration, you may recall, or maybe hearing for the first time, there was a White House Council on Women and Girls. Didn't have any policy staff. It was situated in the Office of Public Engagement. It served more of a PR function, but it did good work, mostly focusing on domestic issues. This is a real pivot and is very much in line with what we're calling for in that first 100-day part of the timeline that you see. Central focus at the White House, reports to the president, has a full-time policy staff and mandate. Every cabinet secretary sits on the council. They have 30 days from the executive order, which was launched on International Women's Day, to name what senior staff will staff this portfolio at each of those agencies, again, domestic as well as foreign. Clear call for all streams of foreign policy within that. So defense, diplomacy, development, trade. Didn't call out immigration, but I think there are a couple of relevant agencies where there's opportunity to work on that. And then they've also got 200 days to launch a national strategy on gender equality, which will contain a foreign policy component. I'll say, just in closing, notably, gender was left out of Secretary Blinken's 8-point priorities that he raised for the foreign policy priorities of the Biden-Harris administration. We're hopeful that that's because we do not have a State Department ambassador on global women's issues in place yet. But I think the question will be to what extent this focus on gender and the elevation of that issue at the White House and across various agencies is equally shared in foreign policy, which it was not under the Obama administration.
Okay, well, that brings up some issues about, and Enrique kind of raised them too, about democracy and democratic institutions. Stephen, President Biden has proposed, there's this balance between, the biggest kind of battle royale now is between democracy and authority and authoritarians and autocracies. And you argue, and I tend to agree, that this could divide the world into hostile camps, kind of prioritizing confrontation over cooperation.
That's right. I mean, the administration or the campaign came up with an idea to hold a summit for democracy. It put this idea forward during the election campaign. It remains, I think, unclear exactly, what that summit will do and who will be invited to it. So I'm, hopeful that if it happens, that it will be a useful place for countries, hopefully with a fairly inclusive list, to share information, try to do things that can strengthen their democracies, maybe combat disinformation, et cetera. But I am concerned, if you look at the record of US foreign policy over several decades, the promotion of democracy and human rights has tended to be an instrument of US geopolitical objectives. And that's already, I think, continuing under the Biden administration. And so, I think we should be really careful to say, let's first of all, fix our own democracy, show that our democracy and other democracies can actually rise to the moment and, address the underlying sources of democratic discontent. That would be a more profitable approach than, holding a flashy summit that might also risk suggesting to states not included that those countries are ganging up on them. And after all, the Biden administration, well, it has this powerful frame, you're right, about a fight between democracy and authoritarianism. It is also talked a lot about the existential challenges of climate change, not to mention pandemic disease, the reason we're all here on this blessed piece of technology, staring at each other and trying to communicate like actual humans. And at a basic level, that those two frames suggest different divisions of the world. As the Biden administration is aware, you simply cannot solve the climate crisis without China, which is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, as the administration knows. So, what we haven't seen yet, I think, in 100 days, fair enough, but nevertheless, we haven't seen a clear sense of prioritization. That is what is actually going to, when we're here in 4 years or 8 years, whether the administration makes a conscious choice to prioritize or events make that choice, that's the question that will be interesting by the end of the administration.
Yeah, Fiona, pick up on that, because, this could be a good organizing principle per se if Biden wants to repair the transatlantic relations. But are the Europeans ready to trust President Biden when he says America's back? There has been a lot of talk in Washington of enlisting Europe to fight against America with and Asian allies in a kind of broad front against Beijing. But the EU is like, look, we are going to conclude this trade partnership with China. That didn't go too well in Washington. You have Nord Stream. The Europeans want to cooperate more with Russia. So, is this really, is the rest of the world ready to organize themselves into autocracies and democracies? And does this help the Biden administration?
Well, I think, as we're all suggesting here, that there's a lot of challenges for democracy around the world. Every established democracy needs to do a bit of self-repair. We've seen a lot of democratic backsliding in European countries. And frankly, we've got plenty of our own challenges. And, America was taking a rather authoritarian turn of its own over the last several years, much, I think, to all of our shock, but perhaps not so much of a surprise, given, some of the issues that we've been contending with. And I think that really kind of ties into what Stephen was saying here, because I think there's a lot of skepticism in Europe here about the value of, and other countries as well, about the value of a big democracy splashy summit. What's going to be the practical aspects of this? And is the United States going to get its own house in order? And, when we kind of talk about being back, what do we mean? Are we back to perhaps not consulting them as we used to do in the past and just sort of informing them of decisions that we're taking? There've been plenty of years, long years of complaints from our European allies that they usually find out after the fact that we've made a decision to do something pretty significant. And this has been, kind of part of a long pattern of dealing with China. And, I think it's going to be very difficult if we're going to be trying to order ourselves that, in a way that's always in opposition to just China, or as you're suggesting, to autocracies or authoritarian states kind of writ large, without kind of really a sense of what does that mean. We're not in the superpower confrontation against kind of communism and a sort of capitalist camp like we were during the Cold War after World War II. It's become much messier than that. And the challenge of dealing with China, I don't think we want to be in a full-blown open confrontation with China like we were with the Soviet Union for so many decades. We've got to figure out, as we're all saying here, for all kinds of for perfectly good reasons, about how we also engage with China, how we kind of create opportunity out of this relationship. As Stephen's saying, that China's and you're saying as well, biggest significant emitter of greenhouse gases. We're going to have to develop with them, as Enrique is, suggesting. China's everywhere right now in terms of trade and economic development. And so I think we're going to have to really consult with our allies. And it's not just the question of Europe. I mean, one thing that I noticed most distinctly over the last 4 years of the Trump administration is we lacked a holistic conception of this. We tend to segment the world into various regions, and this is always a flaw. China doesn't really do that. I mean, of course, it talks of itself as the Middle Kingdom, so it sort of sees everything from its own perspective, and it's very useful to look at other people's maps to see how the world looks from their vantage point. Talking of Canadians, which we did when the Canadians were in charge of the Arctic Council, I was on a visit to Canada, and they spread out a map in front of me of looking at the world from the vantage point of Canada and the Arctic. And believe me, the world looks like a very different, rather cold and frosty place from that vantage point. But you see how different things look from other people's perspectives. And that's, I think, what the United States needs to do. We need to start engaging with all of our allies and talking to them and consulting with them. Because I don't think, again, that they're going to be trusting us, seeing us back if we're not in the process of consultation. And I think there's a lot of trauma right now, not just on the part of the Europeans, but also Canadians, Mexicans, and many others. I think thinking about the way that we've kind of ridden roughshod over them, not just in the last 4 years, but in previous administrations as well, in terms of not engaging on critical issues, not listening to them and hearing their perspective.
Enrique, let's talk a little bit about migration coming from the southern border. As you've pointed out, this is a crisis not just for America, but it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a climate crisis. It's a food crisis. Talk about the policies a little bit. We just have a few minutes left that President Biden is implementing and the narrative that he's trying to change and the unintentional consequences we're seeing in the border right now without, obviously wants to change the narrative, but maybe there's not enough preparation for everybody that's needed at the border right now.
Yeah, my favorite topic, migration. I think, we learned a lot from the media the last 2 weeks. I do believe Biden administration and Biden campaign, Biden-Harris campaign, try to change the narrative for sure. Very different approach than Donald Trump. Close borders, the wall, closing some the bans and many things against the immigration, right? And President Biden approach is more, let's say, soft, more open doors. And you need to be very careful with that. During the campaign, there were very, very pro this narrative. And many people said, well, you need to be careful because U.S. is not prepared on infrastructure to receive thousands of people coming from Central America. That's something very important, Elise. I mean, these countries are listening, right? They are listening. And sometimes domestic agenda obviously influence foreign policy. So imagine a family in Guatemala or El Salvador or even Mexico. I mean, Mexicans are not trying to, it's very different approach. Mexicans stop coming to the US because economy and because the USMCA, I think, and the NAFTA agreement help very, very well Mexico on developing a lot of, you know, manufacturers, jobs, and the rise of medium class economy in Mexico. But in the Northern Triangle, imagine 8 or 7 out of 10 homes in these countries have a relative in US already, okay? Working, living, undocumented, or legally working here, living here. So they are listening, and they're listening to their relatives. So with this new narrative, many of them said, well, now is the time. The pandemic is now a little bit more control. There is a new government. They will allow us to get in, and that is what is happening right now. We have 5,000 plus or more kids. That's the only segment that the U.S. is receiving non-accompanying kids. We're talking about 18 and less, and all the rest, the U.S. is returning back to Mexico, even if they are Guatemalans or Salvadorians or Nicaraguans, and the crisis in the north of Mexico, it's high. So the change is not a crisis for America. I mean, I don't believe Americans needs to worry about these people coming. I mean, it's a very manageable number of people. The crisis is for the kids, for the families, and the crisis is in their countries. The economy, hurricanes, political instability, I mean, persecutions. I mean, on gender, it's just amazing and terrifying when you heard the stories about women living in these countries, even in my country, even in Mexico. It's just amazing. But again, I think Biden and his administration in the coming weeks or months will need to decide which way they need to take on migration, because there is a lot to lose if they don't do the right things there.
Yep. Lyric, we're going to go to the students for their questions, but just quickly, fit that what Enrique was saying about women and particularly the violence facing women at the border, below the border, really. In terms of Biden's equity agenda, you know, we had a lot in the State Department, a lot of institutional knowledge, particularly on the women's front and on the equity front, racial equality. Really kind of dissipated under the Trump administration. So talk just very briefly about, you know, some of the equity issues that President Biden's team is setting up, and the need to kind of think a little bit bigger about, we don't just need more women in foreign policy, we need to think about these issues too.
Absolutely. Representation won't save us, although they're doing an extraordinary job on representation. So I mentioned the gender strategy that's mandated by the executive order. That mandates all agencies, foreign and domestic, to review their programs and budgets. We haven't seen the president's budget request yet, but the agencies are reviewing their budgets to see how those advance or hinder gender equality, and then make corrections accordingly. They have 200 days to do that. Similarly, there was an executive order on racial equity and a whole of government initiative on that will be led by Susan Rice out of the Domestic Policy Council. Similar exercise there, everybody going through their budgets and their policies and making sure that those are advancing racial equity and justice, and making corrections where it's not. On gender-based violence, this is a president who considers this a legacy issue for him. He was one of the founding sponsors of the Violence Against Women Act, which of course has authorized all of our sexual assault and domestic violence programs since the 90s. He is also was the original sponsor of something that never passed Congress called the International Violence Against Women Act. But in the executive order on gender, he did establish a gender-based violence senior official who will be at the White House, as well as a national gender-based violence strategy. There's also been new initiatives announced since the killings of 8 people outside of Atlanta, 6 of whom were Asian American women, to stop Asian hate out of the Justice Department, and a couple of high-level appointments that have been promised there. So I think this is clearly a priority. It's been a campaign priority and seems to be, both from a policy and a people perspective, something they're prioritizing going forward.
Okay, well, now we're going to go to some students to ask some questions of the panelists tonight. The students asking questions have all attended the Washington Center Inauguration Seminar. They're enrolled in a course at Suffolk University connected to this discussion series. So it's really great to have them. And then we're going to go to some Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function. And we'll see we'll get to as many as we can. But first, we're going to go to our students. Our first student is Will McCarthy. Will, take it away.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to our fantastic panelists for being here today. I really appreciate the conversation. Again, my name is Will. I'm a grad student here at Suffolk, part of the Master's Public Administration and Applied Politics program. And my question is for Enrique. Going off of your what you're talking about a minute ago about the migration challenges we face right now at the southern border. I know you're talking about, there's so many kind of things going on, and it's, everything intersecting together. Are there any areas or aspects of the immigration issue or the U.S. relationship with Mexico that you think gets overlooked, and that you think we should focus on more in that conversation about migration?
Thank you, Will. I think amazing question. Eight Congress members from the U.S. sent a letter to President Biden 2 weeks ago, saying the migration issue, it's super important. The U.S. needs to help with vaccines to Mexico and Central America. That's one. We know U.S. have at least 3 times the doses that the population needs, okay? So the U.S. needs to start deploying some vaccines to countries. And on which arguments? I think it's basically 2 arguments. One, it's the economy. In order for these countries, Mexico, Guatemala, to recover the economy, they need to get out of the pandemic, right? First step, let's try to move on from the pandemic, and obviously we are in the middle of that. And the second is it's economy and also the connection, right? Mexico received 35 million of U.S. visitors every every year. Just in the border, Will, in a regular day, 1.2 million people cross our border, and $1.5 billion on goods cross the border every day. So I think U.S. needs to find a way to prioritize. I think Canada is in a very good shape on vaccination. It's a very, very smaller country, 39 million people. On Mexico, you're talking about 130 million people, right? 3 million jobs lost in the last year. So we need to mitigate that. I think it's economy. Now, the thing with development, it's midterm, long term, right? With Obama, we talk about a plan for Central America, $4 billion. Nothing happened. With Donald Trump, another $4 billion. Nothing happened. And now we're announcing again, deploying, billions of dollars. and nothing will happen. CBP, for example, just in one decade, the budget from CBP passed from $5 billion to $17 billion. And the crisis and the problem is still there. Actually, we are arriving to the highest number of apprehensions in the border. And so a lot of money thrown away, a lot of, institutions created here and there, and the problem is still there. So I don't know. I mean, that's my view and factors. I mean, it's very hard to implement that strategy. I don't want to be in that shoes, right? But again, I think we need to work all together. The business sector play a huge role. The civil society plays a huge role, and institutions plays a huge role.
Okay, well, thanks, Enrique, and thanks, Will. Let's go to Autumn Tyler, who has a question. Autumn, floor is yours.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be here today. I'm a graduate student at Suffolk getting my master's in applied politics. My questions are for Lyric. First off, as a leader of numerous advocacy coalitions fighting for women's rights, what do you think should be done about the disproportionate impacts that the pandemic has had on women globally? Additionally, with respect to feminist foreign policy, what do you think can be achieved under the Biden administration? Is there hope for transformational change, or do you predict that we could be left to settle?
Thanks, Autumn. Great questions. On the first one, I think we actually, because we are witnessing unprecedented crisis, I think we actually have an unprecedented opportunity to fix a lot of the structural issues that underpin gender inequality and have rendered women disadvantaged in everything from the economy to political dialogues to health outcomes, et cetera. I do think that partly because the press attention to things like the unpaid burden of care work that women shoulder at roughly 3 times the rate of men before the pandemic has really helped to create a political opportunity where we saw something we've never seen before last fall, which was bipartisan consensus in Congress and an unprecedented investment in care. The United States is the only industrialized country that does not have a mandatory paid family leave scheme. We still do not, but the investments that were made both last fall in the first crisis legislation response and then just recently in a not bipartisan but still unprecedented scale in the American Recovery Act, invest billions of dollars in childcare. I think the campaign promised $775 billion investment in child, elder, and healthcare. These are duties that are performed by unpaid or underpaid women. And I think the stories about, the heartbreaking personal profiles of both folks who are dealing with school closures, dealing with kids at home, as well as the largely Black and brown healthcare workers who were on the front lines of response and are completely underpaid. There's migration patterns associated with this as wealthy, largely white households are importing labor to deal with their own care deficits, et cetera. I think we have an unprecedented opportunity to address this. And my goal is that although the American Recovery Act is a 1-year time horizon, that becomes the new normal and we actually have a political imperative to address this. If we don't, I shudder to think about what happens in the next pandemic, but I'm choosing to be an optimist because the policy responses that we have seen have been both unprecedented in scale and at least 50% of the time bipartisan in nature. On the question of feminist foreign policy, will we see it? I predict that we will get all of the pieces on our timeline, the actual policy recommendations. I think we'll get a lot of those taken. Whether they use the F word, I don't know. I think the political people will make that decision and probably not the policy people. And if I get 100% of my policy asks and not the container that it's labeled in, I'll still go home a happy girl.
All right, thank you, Autumn, and thank you, Lyric. Megan Qualters, you're up.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. My name is Megan. I'm a junior at Suffolk, and I'm a PPE major, which is Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. And my question today is for Stephen. So you co-founded the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, whose stated mission is to move away from war and towards peace. Does this mean drastically reducing our defense budget and demilitarizing our foreign policy? You say in an article of yours, Americans Go Home, that the US is protected to dozens of countries throughout the world. If this is the case, then how should we reduce our military forces, particularly in our NATO alliance, without hurting those countries, but still accomplishing that mission?
A terrific question. Yes, my view is that we should significantly cut our military budget, not mainly to save money, actually, though that would be nice, and certainly not with the expectation that we will banish war from the world. That won't happen, but mainly to make us safer. In the name of national security, we make ourselves, in my view, less safe by scattering forces across the world and acquiring globe-spanning adversaries to match our globe-spanning military presence and alliances. So I think it would be naive to think over the long term that the United States can continue to divide the world into subordinate allies that were sworn to defend by force, and then that leaves all others to be potential adversaries, and think that war will not result. So in order to end endless war, yes, that means not just winding down ongoing combat operations in the Middle East, it means more powerfully reevaluating and reducing some of our commitments abroad. I think it's an anachronistic and frankly, a dangerous and counterproductive grand strategy for the United States in the world of the 21st century, which is so different from the world of the mid-20th century. And you're also right about to anticipate some of my views about the NATO alliance. I would, in a sense, do exactly the opposite of what we saw President Donald Trump do. Trump browbeat allies, sometimes suggested that they were enemies. On the one hand, that wasn't very productive. And then on the other hand, Trump raised US military spending even further. And instead of contracting any alliance commitments, actually allowed alliance commitments to expand with the inclusion of new members into NATO over the 4 years of the Trump administration. I think we should do exactly the opposite. We should politely work with our European allies and partners and say, look, this is just an anachronistic role for the United States to continue to play for the indefinite future over a gradual time period, let's say 8 years. We're going to be reducing our role in NATO, shifting command over to Europe. There's actually been increasing discussion in European capitals, including in public, about their desire for strategic autonomy, given how unreliable the United States has seemed to be. And I think, that certainly won't be their preference in the short run, many European governments, to have the United States protection militarily reduced. But I think would be a tremendous win for the American people. And I also think over the long term, it may well serve the stability of Europe better than a situation in which the United States, given the erratic way in which we've seen it act, should be trying to, make security decisions for the Europeans and try to do that better than they can do it themselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Megan. Okay, last but not least, we have Rebecca Zlotowicz, who has a question for Fiona.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for being here today. My name is Rebecca Zlotowicz, and I am a sophomore at Suffolk University studying political science. So I actually have two questions for Dr. Hill. There's been evidence of some tension between the President of the United States and President Putin. Many security intelligence agencies have discovered ways in which Russia interfered in our most recent general election, not through hacking, but through media smear campaigns. As an expert on American-Russian relations, do you see this threat being addressed anytime soon? And in your opinion, how will this impact our relationships with other world powers and our trust in their support? And my second question is a more personal one. What was the biggest takeaway from your time working in the White House, and how has that experience changed your perspective?
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Those are great questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone, tonight, as I think all of us do, for this great conversation. In terms of what we've seen Russia do in this election, as in previous elections, unfortunately, it's part of a long-standing pattern. In fact, we can see evidence of Russian interference campaigns stretching back over decades. Right back into the kind of period even in World War II and just after. So this is something that's not going to be addressed easily because it's part of an extraordinarily long-standing pattern. It's just that the reason that we're so cognizant of it is today is because the tools are different. So Russia is engaged, as I've said, for a very long time in influence operations, often smear campaigns against, kind of one candidate and another. Joe Biden is just, one in a long stretch of candidates. In fact, he's been targeted before, and as someone who's been, previously a vice president of the United States and a senator of the United States, I mean, there's obviously a lot of information on him there, and he's had a long-standing set of relationships with Putin and with others in the Russian system. But it's the way that Russia found that it could exploit social media, particularly platforms of Facebook and Twitter, as well as, the other efforts that we've seen, the kind of a hacking and release of emails, personal correspondence, and the way that they were able to also use internet platforms to propagate this. There was obviously a bit of a departure from the past. So the tools have amplified Russia's efforts and made them, much more damaging than they had been previously. But what I'm going to say next relates to the second part of your question, because I came away from the White House, and I've said this, repeatedly publicly, much more concerned about the state of our domestic politics than I was actually about the national security crises, because, what the Russians exploited was our own internal divisions and our own political polarization and our own partisan rancor, and many of the issues that we've all been talking about tonight. So the kind of vulnerabilities in our own system and our own democratic backsliding and the propensity of our own politicians to want to stay in power and, to kind of put themselves, frankly, in their own political ambitions above the country. And it's that Russia was able to exploit. They didn't create any of the divisions that they played upon. They didn't, in some cases, even create some of the compromising material they were spreading about people. Americans did that. They created internet personas, and they set up all kinds of bots, kind of computer systems to propagate things and, spread things around. But often conspiracy theories or the smear campaigns against someone like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or many other people within the political firmament were created by other Americans. We have allowed, through Citizens United, enormous amounts of money to enter our campaigns. People can set up, and they continue to do so. It's in the press every single day. Political action committees, we could all put our money together to set one up, to push forward our own political agenda. Not suggesting that we all do this afterwards, but we could do it, and we could kind of go after particular candidates. Sometimes it's for positive things, to advocate for issues like Lyric is trying to do on gender and gender equality. Otherwise, it's for incredibly negative things. And again, it's these political action committees in the United States that have provided the information for people like Putin and others to prey upon and play upon. In fact, what Putin and the Russian security services do is they act like their own kind of super PAC, and they use the information that we're providing and they push this around. So there's not any easy answer to resolve this. In fact, the only way to resolve it is for us to get our own act together. And it's by basically trying to tackle our own internal divisions. That's what I came away from my time in government. And then we will reduce our own vulnerability. Basically, our own democracy doesn't fix itself. We all have to fix it. And it's by having these kinds of conversations, and by having everybody engaged in analysing and addressing the problems, that we will be able to do that. So I'd just like to commend you and all of your colleagues at Suffolk University. You're going to be the people who help us to fix this. because it's in universities, it's through think tanks, it's through advocacy and action that we'll get this addressed. And the more that we can pull together, the less opportunity will be for Putin or anyone else, frankly, to play inside of our politics.
Fiona, one of our audience members, Aya, asks, and this kind of fits into what you were saying, how does legislation like the Georgia voting law, events like the past election and insurrection about America's credibility and influence around the world on topics related to democracy and fair elections? It sounds like you're saying, obviously, the Russians have kind of helped, it's kind of like it helped us inject a flesh-eating disease into ourselves. But really kind of taking glee in the fact that we're destroying our own credibility and influence through our own backsliding of democracy.
No, that's absolutely right. I think, kind of for Putin and others, they can just step back and say, my work here is done. They were certainly trying to sort of pit us against each other, but we've been doing plenty of that ourselves. And when it comes to, the voting rights legislation in Georgia, I'm turning 56 this year. I am exactly the same age as the Civil Rights Act. And it's astounding to me, that when the time of my lifetime, we're going backwards, not forwards. I moved to the United States in 1989, first actually coming to Boston. And, I have to say, at that point, I was quite shocked. I was just coming in on the tail end of the Boston busing, the efforts to kind of desegregate the public schools in Boston. And there was an awful lot of hostility still in the city and a lot of, kind of rancor that had built up. And, I came, really rather naively thinking that, we'd come to the fruition of the civil rights movement. I was in my 20s, I was starry-eyed, the excitement of, coming to the United States and, kind of later deciding to be a citizen here. And, I've learned over the 30 plus years that I've been here that we're still a work in progress. We have to be constantly, as Daniel Ziblatt from, over the river from Suffolk at Harvard said, kind of in his book about the way that democracies die, we have to constantly democratize our democracy. So we are a work in progress. We've got a lot of work to do. This is why a lot of people have questioned the validity of holding a big democracy summit when we've got to, get our own house in order. And we've got to work very hard to remove this fodder, this fuel for others to exploit. Because, if we look back to the past, in the Soviet Union in the early 20s and, 1930s, when Stalin was coming into power, the Soviet Union at that point exploited slavery, segregation, and the US racial legacy, and the existence of persecution against Black Americans. They invited many prominent African Americans like Paul Robeson, the famous tenor, singer, and other activists over to the Soviet Union. And, they exploited their vulnerability and, tried to say to the rest of the world, look, this is the great America, the great United States that kind of exploits its own population. And here, the Soviet Union, which of course was persecuting its own people at the time, we are showing that we are much more encompassing. And we're going to get more of that as we move forward if we don't fix our own problems.
Stephen, we're just coming to the end of our conversation. Unfortunately, we could go for another hour. There's so many great questions and so many issues to discuss. Here's a quick one for Stephen, and then I want to ask the panelists kind of for some final closing thoughts with a question from our audience. Isabel asked, Stephen, you have a lot of experience with the UK, teaching and living there. Do you think the Trump administration had an effect on Brexit? And do you think Biden can mend the UK EU relationship? And I would add by extension the relationship with the US. I mean, there is a lot of family dynamics going on there.
Well, this might be a question for Fiona as well. I think having been, yes, in the UK, going back and forth at least during the period of the Brexit vote, as well as in 2016 when Trump was elected, that just to relate to what Fiona was saying just a moment ago, there's a tendency, I think, for factions domestically when votes come out the way they don't like to blame foreign actors. It's just a lot easier than blaming your neighbors and fellow citizens. And that's quite destructive because it tears at the fabric of what binds citizens together in a democracy. And so I think, you know, despite problems with the Brexit vote, that was a vote that citizens of the UK took for reasons of their own. And I think in our past several elections, despite unfortunate interference by other actors, you know, Americans fundamentally conducted free and fair elections on all of those occasions. And we shouldn't be, you know, delegitimizing our own citizens, members of the opposing party, and other political leaders that we don't like, by, you know, suggesting that Russian interference is something more than it is. It's a problem, but it's not as though our vote system was rigged, and that's a fundamental difference. And so I think, you know, we sort of need to have more respect for. I saw there was another question also about how the United States has interfered in governance in other countries, including in elections or through coups and so forth. I think we need to have a more realistic view of what the United States is in the world, and how other people react when we meddle in their affairs. We can see that we certainly don't like it, even when there's relatively, in the scheme of world history, low-level meddling in our affairs. There's some insight there for us to take forward and hopefully heal some of our divisions as a country.
Okay, well, we're kind of winding down, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask a kind of big picture question, and as we close, ask each of our panelists to kind of think of this in terms of their patch. So Christina asks, how does the Biden administration win support from the wider American public for any foreign policy initiatives, especially in terms of how they'll impact so-called kitchen table issues that impact a middle class or feels left out, losing ground? But tonight we talked, and you know, Fiona, I think, was particularly thoughtful about, you know, how our political polarization is affecting how we project ourselves in the world. You know, President Biden is talking about this foreign policy that benefits the middle class. He's also talking about how we can fix that and strengthen our middle class through a competition with China. But at the same time, we're juggling these big ticket national security issues like North Korea, Syria, Iran, Middle East peace. So, you know, as we close, let's think about where's the balance here. We need to, as Fiona said, self-care and strengthen ourselves at home economically, democratically, but we do need to make sure the world doesn't explode. So we've heard a lot from Fiona and Stephen in the last couple of minutes. Enrique, why don't you start and we'll go around the room.
Well, I think few things match with the Democratic and Republican agenda to have all the Americans, like, you know, truly engage in a one plan. But I do believe infrastructure is one. I think President Biden is going for a big, huge plan on infrastructure. I think he announces $2 trillion on that. I think that can help if they implement. I mean, if the Congress and the Senate pass the bill and they implement a good strategy to deploy this infrastructure, not only on, you know, the airport and ports and roads, but also on every infrastructure America needs on technology. I think that can help a lot to bring together the Senate, the Congress, and both parties. I don't see, and that is obviously on the topic with China and supply chains. I mean, the infrastructure is needed as the platform to build a more competitive America. I don't see on other topics, migration and, you know, even the vaccination and the pandemic and other stuff. I mean, that the agenda match.
Lyric, what about you? How do you deal with some of these kitchen table issues? And I would say, you know, gender today is something that the American public, gender and racial equality is something the American public feels very strongly about. And we've seen this real push to get equity in these fields how do they win support for wider foreign policy initiatives while also, dealing with juggling these big national security initiatives?
I have two thoughts on that question. The first is, and this is a core tenet of our work on a feminist foreign policy, is the importance of policy coherence. And that's not just across all streams of foreign policy, but implementing the same principles and commitments to, in this case, women's rights, but whatever issue you're talking about at home and abroad. We're the industrialized country that doesn't have a mandatory paid leave regime. We are one of a handful of pariah nations that has not ratified the International Convention on Women's Rights, nor have we on disability or children or any other demographic, because we don't like treaties. But just to say that I think that the impetus to practice what we preach at home and abroad is important. But at the same time, I do get a little nervous because I think that the world that I operate in is one that cares about things like the universality of human rights, and is a little nervous about having to make the case for foreign engagement, multilateral cooperation, intervention of any kind, by being able to say that this is benefiting America at home. It sounds a little America firsty to me. I think that both parties are reckoning with the fact that they have to be able to talk to, quote, real America, and that foreign policy is just not an issue that, quote, real America cares about. Americans consistently radically overestimate how much we're spending on foreign assistance. For instance, roughly 25% of our budget, it's less than 1%. And so I think there is a political maneuvering that's happening to try to speak to that audience and assuage fears that the elites are running off and caring about the rest of the world at our expense. But I am hopeful that the policy imperatives and formulation still take at heart some of these fundamental truths that I at least believe in, such as the universality of human rights and the need to do this work, whether it's good for us or not.
Stephen, what do you think in terms of this whole foreign policy for the middle class? Is this a bumper sticker? Is this a slogan? And has the administration just kind of positioned, or is there a big idea here?
Remains to be seen. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said early on that the administration would judge every foreign policy by the standard of whether it makes life better for middle-class Americans. And, I share Lyric's concern. Not everything needs to, be in the direct, provable, traceable self-interest of a certain group of Americans that the United States should do. But on the other hand, there does need to be a clear connection between the discernible interests of the American public and what the United States is doing all around the world, spending $1 trillion plus on national security overall, most of that going to the military, not foreign aid. So I hope that the administration does apply this standard to the most fundamental questions of security policy, because that is what our foreign policy, if you look at our priorities, you look at our budgets, that's what it's mostly about at this point. And if it doesn't in fact serve the discernible interests of most Americans to be on a war footing with Iran constantly, or to be sanctioning, isolating North Korea in an attempt, I think a quixotic attempt to get it to give up nuclear weapons, which guarantee the security of its regime. If it doesn't make sense to go into a Cold War with China, which strangely enough, we haven't talked about very much today, but the rhetoric around that is really intensifying, then we ought to be, I hope the administration will say, why are we fundamentally doing what we are doing?
Fiona, bring it home for us in terms of from where we started. We talked about a world that was, changed very much since over the last 4 years, over the last 10 years. And, there is this kind of current of, and we saw it from President Trump sweeping into power, this idea that Americans do feel like we need to kind of look more inward. But how do you do that? How do you kind of look at these at a foreign policy through the lens of the American middle class and strengthening the middle class, and also kind of deal with these, really thorny foreign policy challenges that you've dealt with in the administration, particularly Russia, as Stephen said, China, Iran, Middle East, all of these issues, they don't necessarily fit into the same paradigm.
Well, look, I know we, pretty much out of time, but I think what it is primarily is a major communications issue. And I've often been thinking, in many respects, that, what Biden or some other president needs is as an ambassador to America. You basically have to have somebody going out there and explaining to people in language, that is completely straightforward about why you're doing things that you are, and, why this matters. I mean, picking up on some of the issues that Stephen's been talking about, for example, explaining, kind of about why USMCA matters, kind of how it affects trade, how it affects people's jobs, kind of all the stuff that Enrique was talking about. And Lyric's point about how, the United States can't set an example overseas unless it's actually fixing its own issues. And all of it is about representation. So why are we so concerned about a feminist foreign policy or about gender issues or racial issues when it comes to foreign policy? It's because most Americans don't see themselves reflected in the people who are in government and in the people who are running our foreign policy. They don't see people that they can relate to. This is why it's been so important for the Biden administration to find representation of all kinds of different groups at the top in the cabinet and in all of his senior advisors. But as Lyric said a little bit earlier, I think, as I'm not kind of, misquoting Lyric about, representation won't save us. You have to actually take action and to see, in the whole system of government, kind of people with diverse backgrounds brought in. It's not just a question of gender or race, it's income background, it's geographic background. The United States is geographically polarized. And, people in Iowa don't see that people in Washington, D.C. have their interests, at heart. People down at the border, places like Monterey, just kind of or El Paso, and, just kind of, across the borders between Mexico and the United States, they understand much better what's happening there than people in DC do. We need to find formats, and maybe Zoom helps us, and forums like this, in which we get more of America talking to each other. And a public television, a public radio, universities across the country, they could play a major role in this. If we can't have one single ambassador to America going out there and, trying to figure out how to, talk among ourselves about these critical issues, we can find multiple ambassadors. So I would actually suggest that Suffolk University think about taking it on the road, take this forum on the road, figure out, how you can engage with universities and colleges, community colleges, schools, library systems across the country and have these kinds of discussions. And then, perhaps we might be able to explain why foreign policy might matter for the rest of the country. So it's a kind of a, how do we communicate on all of these issues on a national scale so that people can engage in a discussion about what ails us and about how we should be posturing ourselves nationally and internationally.
All right, well, I have 4 ambassadors right here to America, so I nominate this panel. This was really—
And our students who've been asking the questions as well.
Yes, I think we have about, 100 ambassadors to America with us right now. This was really a fantastic conversation. I want to thank Fiona, Stephen, Enrique, and Lyric, and also thank the Department of Political Science at Suffolk University, Ford Hall Forum, and the GBH Forum Network. I'm going to throw it back to Christina now.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to our wonderful panel. I have to say that it's a little intimidating to be given marching orders by Dr. Hill, but we will try to rise to the challenge. And as a matter of fact, that is exactly the point of these forums that we're trying to hold, to try and demystify a lot of these concepts, not only for our students, but for the wider audience. And remember, these are live events, but they will be taped, they'll be edited, and we are sending them out. We are actually partnering with the American Political Science Association and hoping to be able to use these in many of the ways that all of you talked about in terms of fixing our problems at home and making connections between those problems at home and those problems that we have abroad. There are such intersections here. So this conversation could absolutely have gone on for another hour or two, and perhaps we can invite you back to answer some of those unanswered questions or questions that you posed yourself. So once again, thank you all so much, and go have some delayed dinner.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.